The next topic, I know he touched briefly. Actually, he covered my first slide in his points. But welcome. My name is Ashwini Jarral. I'm the special advisor to the executive director at the institute. And this morning, we just want to have a brief conversation. Of course, this topic can take us hours, days, or even months to cover this topic. So I want to just talk about and cover some of the landscape when it comes to the word artificial intelligence or AI itself. And what we thought was it'll be good to actually give you guys some perspective on what exactly is AI to begin the conversation, then talk about some of the considerations. I know David mentioned some of that. And when it comes to security, when it comes to privacy, when we're trying to build the models, what approaches we should be taking to actually build these models. But also, as we talked about the lawmaking process, the legislation, and all this stuff, are we doing a great job of informing these lawmakers and what the current landscape looks like and what we're looking in currently and in future as these legislature laws are being passed. So we have two great speakers here. So we have Ben Bawden from Brooks Bawden and more. He is a longtime friend of the Institute and working with us on some of the key topics. So I'll let them do a quick intro. And then we also have Jarral Gallant from Amazon Web Services, longtime IJIS member and very active participant in some of the key activities. So Ben, do you want to just do a quick intro?
Sure, thank you, Ashwini, and thank you, Maria, and the whole IJIS team. And it's great to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the first couple of days of this, mainly because I couldn't spend the nights at Tootsie's. But I also know I missed some good presentations, including from Colonel Brennan yesterday and everything else. So as Ashwini said, and I think I know a lot of you, but Brooks Bawden Moore, we're a DC-based consulting government relations firm, and all we do is public safety policy-related work. And so we work with a number of law enforcement associations, about 8 associations actually, plus a number of other nonprofits and advocacy groups and research organizations in this space. So we're steeped in a lot of the policy stuff, and it's been really interesting and a steep learning curve when it comes to this artificial intelligence stuff. So I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about what we're seeing in Washington. And I'm a little bit freaked out by what I just heard there. So I know Joe said this is just fear mongering, but yeah, they mongered fear, and I'm fearful now.
Thanks, man. Jarral?
Jarral Gallant. I lead the IJIS program at Amazon Web Services, and the last kind of 9 months to 12 months, we've got a tremendous amount of feedback from customers on privacy and security for the use of artificial intelligence models in justice and public safety. What do? How do we secure our data? How do we ensure we can get good use out of these models, but protect this highly sensitive data and use it in a manner that is responsible for the use of this AI? And you're going to hear us talk a lot about responsible AI and what does it mean. So yes, the IJIS program has its own world, but AI enters into it when we talk about the data that comes from IJIS systems and the use of that data in AI models. And we're going to share a few things about how do you think about AI models and how do you protect that data such that it's yours, it's nobody else's, and it's not, and most importantly, and it's not the public's. So we're gonna focus on a mental model of how to do that.
Thanks, Jarral. So what we thought was before I turn it over to Ben and Jarral, I thought I will talk briefly about the AI concept itself, as David Bray mentioned, and him and I have been talking about a few things that I think we need to do to actually look at the ethical use of AI in our community, but also looking at all the nuances that comes with any new technology. So one of the things is that so this first slide I thought it'll be good since he briefly mentioned, artificial intelligence concept is not new. It has been out there since 1950. And in 1950, a guy named Alan Turing, he was a British polymath. He's the one who actually worked with a few other folks to coin this term. And simply put, what they were looking at as the computers were just being designed and put out there and tested is, can we actually have machines' ability to perform tasks that humans can perform? with the same intelligence, with the same intellect, and that became the actual concept in a paper that he wrote and published, which was basically called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And in that paper, he basically discussed how to build intelligent machines. The concept was intelligent machines, and now fast forward, now we're trying to bring human intelligence and trying to actually bake that into computing power, and hence it's called artificial intelligence. So that is something that has been out there, so it's not new. It's something that we have been looking and working for a while. It's just that thanks to ChatGPT and then Microsoft's investment in ChatGPT with some of the work that Amazon Web Services have done, and Google, like now AI is the, I'll say, not just prevalent in the consumer market, but also in the work that we do. And one of the big things that we have been discussing is how we define AI. So I think Alan in 1950s with his team really did a good job of defining what AI is. We don't have to go and reinvent, and if you just do a simple Google search on definition of AI, I can tell you, you're going to find 100 different variations. And don't trust the source, as David said. We don't know who's publishing it, right? So one of the big things we talk about is, if we go to the next slide, is what is the ethical use? This is the question that we keep coming back to us all the time. So this slide that I have, it's not, I literally, since we're talking artificial, I copied and pasted. I copied and pasted from something that Department of Defense actually published this for how they will be using AI. And when you look and drop the word DOD, and that's exactly what I did, this exactly applies to us in justice and public safety community. The very first thing is, can we basically look at responsible use of this technology? It should actually exercise appropriate levels of judgment, right? Second is equitable, and we always talk about in our community about the justice, equity, and all those things, but it also applies to the technology. How we can avoid unintended bias in justice and public safety. For how many years we have been talking about bias? Simple example, in corrections, in other places we use term risk and need assessment. We have, and I was just having this conversation, in justice and public safety, we have 32 different risk and needs assessment, and now you pick one and go to another one. Good luck, because we already are actually introducing a bias, and we can't even map to what this tool is telling us when it comes to risk and needs. The third principle on ethical use is traceability. When we as an engineer are building this, do we have an expertise to actually understand the operational side and operational need and map it to that, versus other way around where the technology is telling us how to actually bring it into do we have a methodology which also is making it transparent? And that also takes to the next point, which is reliable. Like, can we confidently say that we can rely on this model or the capability? Because AI actually have 7 different variations. If you, I'm sure most of you know, there are 7 different types of AI. And I know we touched on generative AI, but the question is that, can we basically say this, we are relying on this and we're confident and it is well-defined for this domain in which we're trying to use, and it is secure, because security is going to be the big issue. And we have done, I know Jarral is going to touch on some of that, and the governable. And this is something that in our mission, we have to abide by the laws, we have to abide by the policies, and we have to make sure as we're engineering this, designing these capabilities, that they are functioning in a manner for which intended use. But also, if there's something out of the norm, can we pretty quickly actually detect that that's not an ethical use? So these are the 5 principles, and when I read and looked at this, these actually map directly to what we're talking in justice and public safety. So why reinvent when DOD has already done this in early 2000s for us? So that is something. So also, just to set the stage for the next point that Jarral is going to talk about, if we go to the next slide, is we at IJIS Institute have stood up a small study group, and our goal there is to look at the use cases, and we're calling it a study group for justice and public safety. The reason we have decided to do this is that when we were having a conversation in the justice and public safety enterprise or ecosystem, what are we going to call it? We were talking to the 911 folks, we're talking to the policing community, we're talking to the sheriffs and the jail staff, community corrections, the prison staff, and the courts. And what they're saying, this is my use case, this is my use case. When I took a step back and what we started mapping, they were talking about the same use case. but they're not talking to each other. So we're building a matrix that goes across, say, this is the capability, this is the use case, and what the ethical use looks like, and what is the value of this use case is where we're going. And we're also standing up the working group, which is going to take it further. But I want to point one use case that actually stands up out of this use case catalog that we're building. We do have some key players in this space. The use cases around language translation and interpretation. We all have used Google Translate and other capabilities. I know Microsoft has it, AWS has it, and others. But the simple thing that we looked at this one was language translation. How we can use AI to communicate with the non-English speaking folks. When they're actually doing business with us, when they're calling 911, can we basically respond to them? And the current use where it's actually is using right now and in use across the nation is in context of text to 911. How many people here know that you can actually text to 911? And how many people actually have a jurisdiction that's already enabled? Because we still have long ways to go, but we're still moving in that direction. So what you're going to do if the text comes in non-English language? We have the luxury to call language lines or other companies to tap in and do the translation and interpretation. But now we're using AI to basically translate, interpret, and transcript. So we can actually have a dispatcher on the other side effectively communicate and dispatch the right resources in the context of that call. Now we're also doing moving to voice, where we have a technology where you can do active listening on the voice for different languages as the call is coming in. So AI can assist in that with human validation. And the benefit there is that it helps facilitate and communicate when it's a life and death issue. And that is something that we're seeing a huge value. So these are the use cases that we should be using to educate the lawmakers and the policymakers. So I just want to share this as a use cases where we're going as a thought process. And I'm going to turn it over to Jarral to talk about some of the security and the privacy aspect and consideration that we should consider as we're leveraging AI.
Just to expand a little bit on that use case prior to getting into security and privacy. So imagine a 911 operator getting a phone call and not knowing what that language is. Hundreds of languages in the world, having no idea. How does that operator figure out what translation service to use? Time is ticking. It's a real emergency. That operator doesn't know the dialect. They don't know what the language is. They don't even know where to begin. A bot, we heard lots of negativity about bots, but a service that's listening, co-listening, has been trained on hundreds of worldwide languages, in a matter of seconds can pinpoint that language is most likely, with a degree of certainty of X%, 90s, 90 plus, 95%, is a language from this country, from this region, and is probably one of these three in a matter of seconds. Life counts. And that bot can suggest the three language names that it most likely is. And now the agent is presented with this and also can auto-dial the translation services. That is so powerful that a life could be saved as a result of that operator. Instead of being 15, 20 minutes trying to figure out with the help of translation services what it is, immediately get the appropriate translation services on the line or translate in real time if they've chosen to do that. Extremely powerful, extremely helpful. But you have to think about all of that in terms of privacy and security. And if we can look at the next slide, we put together a mental model that we'd like you to kind of think through. People believe AI is just a model. Actually, AI is many models. And we'd like you to think through, if you go from, I guess it's the left slide of the side of the slide. When you think about AI, I'd like you to ask yourself, where are you on this continuum? And we've identified 5 scopes. Scope number 1 is a consumer app, popularized by we know who. It's a public-facing model that you interact with. ChatGPT, GPT is a big one that's out there. It's a website. Claude 3 is a website. AI exists inside enterprise applications that you use. There's snippets of AI that exist in these applications already. Or you could choose to be a greater level of complexity. And by the way, as you move across the continuum, your complexity rises, and your security and privacy concerns change. Pre-trained models, you basically build applications, and you build your application on a version model that you get from a vendor. So whether that's a Google model, or whether that's an Anthropic model, or a Meta model, or our Amazon Titan large language model, or what have you, you build on that. The next scope is you take that model, and here's where it's most important. You train it on your data. You fine-tune it on your data. And then the fifth is you don't do any of that noise. You build your own. You take your data, all of your content, and you use machine learning, and you train it from scratch using model training software like we have called SageMaker or others, and you train it and you build your own. Now, that requires data scientists, that requires artificial intelligence experts. It requires you to really know what you're doing to understand how you train these models. Everyone says, oh, the consumer one, that's got to be the right one. I want you to hear something. And I'll put my glasses on here because I'm starting to, this was quite interesting. I asked two of the leading models, who is David Bray, PhD, this morning? I wish he was still on the line. And I'm just going to read a snippet from a couple of them. He's a renowned expert in technology. He's former CIO of the FCC. That sounds reasonable. Executive Director of the National Commission for Review of Research and Development in the United States Intelligence Community. He's contributed to a lot of cybersecurity, artificial intelligence. He's a smart guy. The next one said, he's currently an executive scholar, and he's chief ventures officer at Philips Healthcare. That kind of sticks out a little bit, doesn't it? He was CIO of the FCC, 25 years experience. He's the author of several books, Virtual Minds Towards a Consciousness Machine, Data Leadership for Addressing Global Existential Risks. Lots of good stuff. A PhD from Oxford Criminology. He's an accomplished leader, author, academic. What I'd like you to understand is these are two consumer-faced apps. Which of those is correct? Are they both correct? I wish David was here. We'd ask him, did he write 2 books? I actually didn't find anything that he wrote 2 books. He probably did, but I couldn't find it. Verifying the model and what you get is most important. What is the truth? And understand. So what I just asked those 2 models is now in the public domain. And that's the most important thing as we move on to the privacy. What I asked those 2 models is now public information. If I feed it, please provide me a 2-page summary of an auto accident involving vehicle going right, vehicle going northbound and southbound with these license plate, male driver, Caucasian, African-American driver, everything I just put into that model. And by the way, this is happening in policing today. That's all public information now. If you happen to seed some private information into that, like a date of birth, like a social security number, like a name, and I ran a criminal history, and this person has a scar mark tattoo that looks like this, that's all public information now. Anything you put into an AI model that's on the consumer side is public. You can't get it back. And you have to verify its inputs. Let's move on to the next slide. And I'm not going to read all this, but and you guys will have these. When you move from the consumer side to the self-trained side, you really have to understand that your control over your inputs. How many people didn't realize that your inputs become public? Every one of your inputs become public when you use a public model. That's what they're there for. They gather your questions and they tune based upon your inputs. As you move across your scopes, your inputs become private to you and protectable by you. So a consumer app, immediately, if you're in an organization that thinks that maybe these consumer available apps are being used, and they're great, they're perfect, right? I had it write a Python program for me that took me 4 hours to write. It did it in 2 seconds. A very complex Python program. It did it in 2 seconds better than I did it. It blew my mind, if you know Python. Blew my mind how smart it was. Pretty non-private information in this. I fed it a complex problem. It wrote me a Python program. I wish I had this when I was in college. But that's pretty public. There was nothing private about that. But let's say I wanted to write a thesis paper on original research. You start to get into very private information or not yet patented information that you need to protect. On the scope 1, you need to create guidelines and educate your workforce on what AI is and how you will use it in your workforce. If these models and guidelines don't exist today, staff are already using this. If it can save someone a minute, 10 minutes, they're already using it. And if they're using it in the public domain, that your private data is already public. You need to have a monitoring and compliance program. So at AWS, the moment we go to any of these websites on our company supplied laptops, a message pops up. Please use this at your own risk. Please use this in nothing related to company business for research purposes only. So our company has flagged all public AI sites, and we are given a message every time that we must acknowledge whatever browser we use, because they want us to know that our information into this is very public. As you move into enterprise apps that, let's say, a Salesforce, God love them, they're a great company. They use a lot of AI. A lot of the ERP vendors use AI inside them. You've got to understand where that data goes. Is your data being used to be part of that model? And when you get into scope 3 with pre-trained models, when you use a pre-trained model, you want to be certain that you understand wherever you use that model, typically it'll be in a cloud service provider, what happens to your inputs? If those inputs, if you cannot be certain your inputs are not used to train the model, then you should never use the model, even in a scope 3. You need to be certain that your inputs stay private, your outputs stay private, and then as you move to fine tunings, that is also yours and is not contributed to the community. AI should not be a GitHub. AI should be private to you. You should have the ability to determine your destiny. And as you move from left to right, self-trained models, you're on your own. But you need to, if you use the tools to go build this, you need to put the guardrails in place. Now, the other thing you need to think about is you have to be able to make assessments of when is the model correct or incorrect. So fine-tuning allows you to get more correct data in your circumstance. If we move to the next slide, again, I'm not going to read all this, but PII, you'll see the term that what we talked about, PII, confidential data, legal implications of using outputs automatically. So let's say I cited those 2 books of David Bray. It happens in students all the time. They say, oh, this looks great. I don't want to look this up. Maybe he didn't write those. Maybe he did. But toxicity and hallucinations are very, very relevant terms inside AI models. And they can create data from your prompts and make it look like it is very, very real. To the tune of some judges in some courtrooms, lawyers have to sign an affidavit that nothing was generated by AI before it was submitted to them. When you move into pre-trained models, be certain you know what your cloud service provider does with that data. Is it yours? Do you keep all rights and use to it? And understand how that data is being used, and can you actually keep it private to you? And likewise, copyright infringement is a huge, you think personal rights is one thing. Copyright infringement is a huge problem with public models. So there's going to be lots of suits about this, but don't assume the data you got out of a model is not protected by someone's patents. So your ability to quote it, use it, it may be subject to someone else's rights, which is important to understand. So all of these things, most importantly, know what scope you're in. Create guidelines, ask your staff, am I in a consumer app? Am I using an enterprise app that has some AI in it? And is the data staying in the United States? Another great question to ask when you're in scope 2. When you're in scope 3, ask what's happening to my use of that model, and is it being improved with it? And as you fine-tune that model, which I'd always recommend, can my fine-tunings not contribute back to the universe, and keep it in the US and keep it private to me? And then self-trained, really understand your legal implications. There was just last comment on this, there was a court case in my home country, Canada, where a bot, an AI bot, gave a recommendation on airfares to a customer, and the customer proceeded with what the bot said, and the airline was sued by the traveler and won because the bot basically cost that person $6,000. It was a small claims court. It's a very interesting early suit on the results of using artificial intelligence to make decisions with really not good training, is what came out of that case, not good training of the bot. And perhaps it suited the business needs, but not the fairness of the data coming out of it. So know your scope and know where your models are. And if you're a model that you interact with on a website, which is so simple on your phone, you have to say you should never use that for any kind of professional work, because the inputs are not secure.
Thanks, Gerard. I do have a few questions, but let's move to Ben.
Well, thanks again. And so this part of the show is about the policy piece, and in particular what we're seeing in Washington, D.C., and a little bit in state capitals. But we spent the last hour and a half listening to reasons why we should be concerned. And lots of policymakers are thinking about what to do about it. It has become the cool thing to talk about these days in policy. There's a lot of really uncool things that are being talked about, but this is like if you're an elected politician and you're not somehow involved in saying that you're going to do something about AI, then you're behind. And the challenge is it's a very small number of people who actually understand the first part of what they're dealing with. And the more I hear stuff like this, and this morning, the more I realize I don't know jack, which goes to the bottom line, I guess, of what I wanted to convey, is the importance of education in the immediate near term. Because lots of people are throwing a lot of wet cement in a lot of different places right now. And before that stuff starts to get hardened, there's an opportunity to I guess, shape it the way that would do minimal damage to public safety use cases, and also maximize protections against negative impacts from a public safety standpoint. So again, I am not technical in the least, very kind of plain English. And so I guess my bottom line for all of this audience is the importance of education in the policymaking context. And that's why, frankly, IJIS, I think, has a really important opportunity here over the next several years. This organization is, a group of industry and public safety practitioners, and across the spectrum. So from law enforcement, courts, corrections, across the whole system. And what that means is that this group has an ability, if it's done the right way, to really get, from a grassroots perspective, a more complete picture, a more complete set of messaging to policymakers at a time when they need it right now. One thing that it just, you sit and you listen to this stuff, and in the middle of Dr. Bray's presentation this morning, we got an email, and some of you in this room may be on FBI OPE's listserv, Brian, and sent a note out to all the state local law enforcement associations this morning saying, hey, heads up, we understand that the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act is tentatively scheduled to be on the floor in the House as a standalone bill next week. So what happened in the 15 minutes after that email hit the inboxes of all of the associations, ICP, National Sheriffs, Major Cities, Major Chiefs, ASHA, was a flurry of notes to the FBI, to Speaker Johnson's office, to Majority Leader Scalise's office, to Chairman Jim Jordan's office, to Chairman Durbin's office, around grassroots down to the boards of all of those associations within 15 minutes of that message hitting. And just because we were sitting in the middle of that presentation, I was like, holy crap, this has just set off a wave of alarmist behavior. What if this message actually isn't real? What if someone sent this just to set us off in a direction? And I wouldn't have thought that except I was listening to Dr. Bray's presentation. But man, it's so easy to just pull the FBI's logo off and put Chief Conti's name on the bottom of it and put 2 paragraphs out. And the email addresses to send it to, and look what can happen. And that if that were disinformation, it would have been very, very effective. So I think it just goes to show the risks that we all face, but it's a risk that we face in our daily lives and our family lives and the basic public safety things that we care about. What if I get a message like that looks like it's coming from the school counselor about my son, saying something's terrible happened, and so we have lots of reasons to be concerned, but we have plenty of reasons to be concerned pre-AI too. I mean, I think that we kind of got to keep it in perspective. And if you look at what the loudest voices are in the policy debate right now, it's industry, folks who have the most to gain and the most to lose from a financial standpoint. It's civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy activist organizations who, as to quote one of them, they are paid for paranoia. So you can count on them being the loudest voice in the room in a lot of places. And that's never going to change. And then you've got what some people call the doomers when it comes to AI, the AI doomers. And very big, loud voices who are household names in industry and popular culture. Some of them are AI doomers. They're the ones, that group primarily, industry, privacy, civil liberties, civil rights, and doomers are the biggest voices in the ears of senators and members of Congress at the Washington level, and then at the state legislative level as well. Public safety so far is an afterthought in our experience when it comes to the people who are trying to figure out how to regulate and legislate seeking input from that group. So again, I go back to why IJIS has such a great opportunity here in the coming months and years in organizing efforts to ensure industry and innovators in this space are educating their public safety customer groups very intentionally so that they're able to speak to policy audiences. And then, equipping those folks that are being educated to educate their own associations. When it comes to Congress passing laws or not passing laws, when it touches public safety stuff, as soon as the law enforcement public safety groups get, a bee in their bonnet, they get very active and they can cause things to happen and cause things to not happen. So how do we really channel that effectively so that people like my team and all the other folks at the Washington level who are supporting public safety policy efforts, that we know at least a little bit about what we're talking about, and we can start to elevate the voice. There are small groups in both the House and the Senate right now that are basically charged with looking into AI, advantages, disadvantages, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and then figuring out what to do from a policy standpoint. In the Senate, there are 4 senators that kind of have lead on that. It's Senator Schumer, Senator Young from Indiana, Senator Heinrich from New Mexico, and Senator Rounds from South Dakota. Those 4 are the Senate quad that are taking briefings routinely from industry and from civil liberties groups and all that. Aside from individual office visits, the public safety groups have not gone to them as a group to say, we're planting a flag. Here are some considerations that you need to think about as you start drafting your bills. As of, I think, this week, there are 20 pieces of legislation pending at the federal level that would have some impact on, there's more than that generally that touch AI, but there are 20 real bills that actually would directly regulate AI in one way or another. Some of them have been assessed by technology developers in the public safety space to be hindrances to innovation in terms of AI products and services for public safety. They need to be told why that they need to think twice about doing something like that. They might not have even known that they were doing it. And in the House, there's a brand new task force that was just created a couple of months ago, and it's chaired by 2 people. The Republican is Jay Obernolte from Southern California, who actually has a PhD in artificial intelligence. There is a guy in the House who actually has a PhD in this stuff and seems to know kind of what he's talking about. His Democrat counterpart is Ted Lieu from Southern California also. A guy who is the primary author of the bill that federal bill pending in Congress that would require a warrant to use facial recognition. So there's a big education effort that's needed. We're seeing groups start to coalesce, and so we're looking forward to working with IJIS. The BBM team is working with IJIS formally on efforts to help organize some of the messaging around this and groups to communicate and educate policymakers. And so we look forward to working with Paul and his group and Maria and Ashwini and the rest of you. Really welcome the opportunity to get our folks better educated so we can be effective in our messaging in the near term.
I was just going to add, if you look over the past, this is going to date me, but 30 years, I think it's important to understand the history of technology advances that we now take for granted. APHIS. Look at the absolute question of a computer narrowing down your fingerprint search, but now we wouldn't think to not use it. Look at license plate recognition technologies, the ability to find a hot plate with a car and know that you got a hit on a stolen vehicle. That enhances public safety. Lots of controversy around facial recognition, but look at what it can do and is doing when responsibly used. There's all kinds of cases in history where technology was questioned, where we thought it wasn't going to be good, be safe, but it got adopted as carefully as we could. The issue with AI is the inflection point is coming much faster, much larger because of the, what did he say, 45 billion broadband connections, because everybody has access to it. When it was APHIS, it was a closed system. It was a tight number of people were impacted. AI impacts everybody. But I think it's important for lawmakers to understand that if we take a look back at history of advances in law enforcement technology that enabled us to get better at what we were doing, we did it successfully and we did it carefully. And let's not throw AI under the proverbial bus, because we don't understand it. Take lessons from history of how we approach those things to responsibly use them and be successful with them.
Thanks, Gerard. So a couple of points I would like to add to what Ben said. Also, White House actually issued an executive order on AI. So if you have not read it, I'll encourage you to read it. But the other key piece that came on March 24th was a OMB guidance for the federal agencies. And it's they basically issued a new policy governing the use of AI in federal agencies. So if you have not looked at it, there are 30 or so pages. Please read that carefully. There's something that every single point that there's mentioned in there on the use of some of the apps. I think IJIS has a key role to play with our partners. Ben mentioned ISCP and National Sheriffs and a few others. I think we just want to make sure that we are taking an active role. The good news is, as we are looking at the use cases in justice and public safety, there's so much positive. We have identified 21 use cases just between courts, corrections, and law enforcement. And all of them have a positive impact, not just on the achieving operational efficiencies, but actually helping solve the crime. And you heard Director Roche talk about, especially child exploitation, how AI can actually be a key tool as an investigative tool. So we have a lot of positiveness. We just need to actually get together as a community and educate. I think, as Ben, to your point, education is the key. And sometime, I know we have competing priorities among industry and association world. We all try to put our name, but I think we have to get together. So I know we have a few minutes left, but I will open up the floor for a few questions for Ben and Gerard. So questions or thoughts?
That's all right. It's on. Okay. So I have kind of a two-part question. So one, we have to get the training out there. We have a lot of, law enforcement agencies with just cities of a few thousand people. And I don't know of any cases of this, but I know people and I know it's being used, or know it could be being used because of those apps and things. And I know at a certain point, we're going to get to, a case is going to go before a court and they're going to be like, the judge is going to be like, you used the word thoroughly and critically a lot more in your report than you used to. And so how do we get that training out there, that guidance? What kind of policies and best practices do we have that we can disseminate? And two, how do we ensure it's unbiased? Because you do have the doomers, you have the advocates. The truth's somewhere in the middle. There are going to be issues, but there's also applications. Criminals, because of the decentralized nature of its disbursement, criminals are already using it. They already have it. If we don't have it and good detection capabilities on the law enforcement end, we're going to fall behind. So how do we get that knowledge out there to make sure it's used correctly and make sure that we're unbiased, we're being as objective as possible?
I would say from a training perspective, your own individual agency and any associations that you're part of that need to really aggressively ask for AI, as much AI, high-level information and training as you can get. So I know ISCP is working on some policy initiatives, and I kind of go back to history. The early days of cloud computing, ISCP published some cloud principles back 10, 12 years ago, and I was part of that initiative with the ISCP team when I worked somewhere else. So ISCP is working, look for them to produce some background, some training, and frankly, look to the various AI vendors to provide you not model-specific training, but training on what is AI, how can it be used, what's responsible AI, and push your associations, like whether it's major city chiefs or whether it's the CIOs or whether it's ISCPs, push those associations to create and curate content, because ultimately with 18,000 agencies in the United States, 90% of which are reasonably small, there's no budgets to go create this on your own. So go to your associations, and your associations will engage with the experts for they themselves to be trained to be able to get that. Bias, to your question on bias, that is a excellent question. And that comes down to the models that you choose, the inputs, and how you interpret the outputs. Like I read from my quick little who is David Bray, PhD, you have to train and you have to have policies in place that you can't take all outputs as golden. You must be able to ascertain and have processes in place to validate your outputs. And that, you know, if you look at, let's say, NCIC, it's a very definitive source of information in a very closed system. Not a lot of people question when they get a hit in NCIC because of the confidence you have in it, confidence that was gained over decades. I would ask that you don't put the same level of confidence in a definitive answer from an AI model unless that model has been trained with your data. So let's say Brian's team decides to throw an AI model in, a private model in front of NCIC to speed up querying, right? You probably have a lot more confidence that that's going to have more accurate data than a generic model that's out there. So understanding from your associations, what is AI? What are the types of AI that you see in the spectrum? Where does the model I'm using, ask, where does this model fit? Am I a consumer model? Am I a self-trained? Ask what it's doing. Don't just trust it. And I think your associations is the best place to do that.
And on the associations front, those associations still need to be educated. So Rick Zach and my former BBM colleague Christian Quinn just put out an article in IACP magazine this week, today, published today. So go on LinkedIn, find their stuff, go on IACP website. It's that kind of stuff that happens over and over and gets forwarded that will help educate folks. Paul Wormley is in IJIS has a committee now that's working on things. The outputs from these kinds of things, I think, will be very helpful, but they need to be purposefully marketed toward the executives of these associations. Like, sit down, let's have a meeting and discuss what we're talking about here. Ultimately, and we can, you know, there probably should be some kind of AI policy summit for public safety, but only after there's been a lot of spade work done to make sure that the participants in that understand what they're coming to. And I think you get something like that where it's industry plus public safety, federal, state, local, criminal justice system-wide coming together to start to get some common talking points that they're all doing. I think we can take some concrete steps to get there, because I completely agree. That's what associations are for. They're supposed to, from a policy standpoint, be a resource to educate their members. And we're not quite there yet. I think we can get there, and thanks to those kinds of articles and some thought leadership from this group and others, we'll get there.
And Ben, a couple of points I would like to make is that as we're standing up the working group, if you're an IJIS member or a practitioner, please, we encourage you to join that. Our goal is to put the educational material for executives, for the operators, and for the technologists and the policymaker. Also, since you brought the AI Summit, IJIS will be hosting, and I know Maria's going to talk a little bit more, AI Public Safety Summit sometime in summer. So we will be hosting that. We're already planning. We're in active discussion with that. There's more news to come on this topic from IJIS, but I just want to put out there. I know we're out of time, but
Brian has a question.
Brian, go ahead.
I don't want to keep us long if we are.
As long as you buy everybody a drink.
So I just wanted to make one point and then ask your opinion of this. How do we change the dialogue about AI? We continue to use that as this overarching moniker, artificial intelligence, when in fact, as we heard Dr. Bray say here, you know, AI is a spectrum. You've been talking about it's how the different versions of AI. We've been using AI for decades. Every fingerprint algorithm that we have implemented has had a degree of artificial intelligence. The reason that I bring this up is it feels like you mentioned the executive order. The executive order basically is putting controls on AI writ large, And as any good bureaucracy would do, we're spending a whole lot of time going back and looking at versions of AI that have been instantiated for years, that are perfectly normalized, but we're going back and returning our fingerprint biometric through the AI Ethics Council. We're returning and using common name algorithms through the AI Ethics Council. When it feels to me like our focus needs to be on generative AI, our focus needs to be in some areas that where the technologies really are kind of uncontrolled. How do we change the conversation so that we can make sure that when we receive directives, orders, legislation, and policy, that it's not this broad AI, artificial intelligence, broadly speaking, but it's focused on what the real issues are, contemporary issues are.
Sure, Ben. Your thoughts?
So this sounds silly, but it goes back to that education piece. Policymakers, for the most part, when they're doing their public talking points and doing their press releases, it's artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence. It's all the same. We should be scared of all of it. And I think pointing out the advantages, disadvantages of generative AI versus AI that's been in use for a long time is very, very important. I mean, that's part of what I know that the executive order that was issued requires, I guess, by December 31st of this year, every single federal system that's in use that may be rights impacting or safety impacting, which is a laundry list of everything that you could possibly imagine, which basically means every system in use in the federal government has to be subjected to some kind of review and then reported back. What they're going to do with that report, I don't know. But it's a great question, and it comes back to the need to educate at a basic level public safety leadership and the ones that have the biggest voices to tell regulators and legislators, here's where it's most worth your time being spent. Here's where you may think you're doing something, but you're actually really not. There's also, to that point, and I don't know if others in this room, I know this message went out to law enforcement, and I know the webinar is intended for law enforcement primarily, but just this morning it went out from Office of State Local Law Enforcement at DHS. They're having a webinar on April 11th. But it said that the intended recipients are law enforcement and those who provide support to law enforcement. So I don't imagine that we can check and see if from OSLLE, if I just can send out that link to IJIS members and if industry can come on. I'm not sure that they'll say yes, but that's happening with DHS on April 11th.
I guess my comment would be, I think it's important to educate on what's generative AI versus AI that's been in existence for 25 years, as you said. AI that's been trained on billions of public inputs, billions, versus closed circuit AI is very different. You know, and I would suggest to you that there's a lot of confusion between decision support systems, which are closed circuit systems, and publicly available billion parameter AI models, both of which have their own unique places in what it can do. And I always like to talk about, let's talk about the use case. And if the executive order came out and used something as bland as AI, right, that if I'm in your shoes, I would exclude decision support system out of that and only focus, of course, I'm not in your shoes, but I would only focus on AI models where there are modern billion parameter plus inputs into it to train it. DSS is very different. And the algorithms, in particular in fingerprints, frankly, I believe those are DSS. To coin an old term we used to use in the 80s, I believe that's not artificial intelligence in today's thinking of what modern artificial intelligence is. Yeah. My 2 cents worth.
Yeah. All right. But there's one more. So let's take one last question, then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so just one comment, I guess, as they're looking at this, and there's so much talk about AI, you know, a lot of organizations are struggling to understand like what this means in a continuum. And I think of it more of like a motor vehicle, right? just like motor vehicles, there are many types, many purposes, many uses. And just like the motor vehicle legislation and the infrastructure that's been built, it's going to take a long time for us to get our hands around it. There was the same type of FUD like and fear that was happening whenever motor vehicles were first being released, and the police forces worked on horseback, and they're like, how are we ever going to keep up? Like, we can't do this. It's a fundamental change to the way that we operate. And the same thing is happening now with AI. If you think about it now, we look at it, everyone assumes motor vehicles are going to be used. There are laws and controls around it. There's licensing around it. There are departments that their entire job is to ensure that the licensing is in place. The same thing's going to happen over time in policing and in the legislation, but it will take years, hopefully not as much time as it took for the world to adapt to motor vehicles, but it's the same kind of analogy. And so I think part of the value of organizations like IJIS is that they can be the same organization that pulls that information together, helps organize, helps advocate for the right way to implement change and to adopt change, right? They're implementing change is one thing where you're trying to push it, but encouraging the adoption, encouraging the thinking is super important. And that's where we're at. That's the educational space that we're in right now. We've moved beyond, everyone knows that there is AI out there, just like everyone knew there were motor vehicles, but we haven't yet figured out how we're going to use them both individually and then as an organization, and of course as an entire society. So we got a ways to go. That was my comment. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. Let's give a round of applause for Ben and Jarral.